vaccines unfold in Wuhan. Prior to becoming an author, I was a consultant in the medical industry and advised big companies, and over the years developed an expertise in pandemic response. And in February, a former cabinet minister asked me to prepare a report for Matt Hancock on what I thought was going to happen with this pandemic. And I'd been particularly aware of the sort of situation with the original SARS outbreak. And so I was concerned about a number of things and sent my report in to Matt Hancock. The primary concerns that I had were going to be the long tail risks of coronavirus. Obviously, with the original SARS outbreak, we'd seen upwards of up to 30% of people suffering long-term chronic sequela complications from infection. I was also concerned about the possibility of reinfection and sustained immunity to coronavirus, because it's common knowledge that coronaviruses, over the years we've built up a body of knowledge that shows we don't sustain immunity to them. I then started writing about the pandemic for a number of publications. And along with Dr. Deepti Gurdasani, was one of the co-founders and organizers of the John Snow Memorandum, which many of the people here have signed up to, advocating a suppression policy, getting cases down as low as possible. I think actually this whole pandemic is a political failure. The virus can be defeated. We understand, the virus quite well now, the mechanisms, the dynamics of it, how it's transmitted, what it does, the impacts of it. And we've seen that other countries can control it. We've seen that, countries that have pursued elimination strategies have been able to live more or less normal lives, with some exceptions to border control, sporadic lockdowns, very effective test, trace, isolate support systems. But other than that, countries that have pursued elimination strategies have tended to be able to live much more normal lives. And by every measure, countries like New Zealand, Taiwan, until recently Singapore, have been able to allow their populations to carry on much as they did before. So what's the difference? Why did those countries do well, and countries in the West like the UK, America, Sweden, Holland, to a lesser extent Germany, France, why have they done so badly? And if you look at what distinguishes those countries, it's political leadership and the approach that they took, in contrast with the approach taken in the elimination countries. And the failings, I think, have been threefold. I think they've been a failure to inform, a failure to protect, and a failure to prepare. Right from the outset, there was a lot of controversy over whether the virus is airborne. And right from the outset, actually, if you listen to Professor Chris Whitties, who is England's chief medical officer, in evidence he gave to Parliament in the beginning of March 2020, he said the virus is airborne. Nothing was made of that. If you listen to Dr. Tedros of the WHO in March, he also says coronaviruses are airborne. Nothing was made of that. A great controversy arose over whether transmission was airborne or fomites or droplet, and we now know, as has been accepted, in a strange way by the WHO and more openly by the CDC, that the virus is airborne and it can be transmitted, through close contact, because you're going to get more exposure if you're close to people, but also through sharing air with people in large crowded spaces. And there was a recent, huge cluster at a festival in Holland where 1,000 people got infected, supposedly outside, but basically it looks as though they've shared the air inside a giant tent, and possibly toilet facilities and stuff. But that one thing, failing to inform populations that the virus is airborne, has caused so much harm, because you know, everything from frontline healthcare workers haven't been able to protect themselves adequately and were in surgical masks when treating coronavirus patients or suspected coronavirus patients, instead of using N99 FFP3 respirators. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that there's an exposure element to this virus. So the higher the dose you have, the worse your outcomes. So even if a mask isn't fully protective, it can help in lowering your exposure. It's been one of the great crimes of the pandemic that there are still governments out there that won't acknowledge airborne transmission. And it seems to be, if you dig deep enough, it seems to be an economic issue, because once you acknowledge airborne transmission, you have to invest in filtration for schools, you have to invest in ventilation for schools, you have to change the way that pubs and restaurants, hotels, bars, transport, everything where shared air is a factor. You have to invest in all these things and change guidance on that. I think the other failing is that governments failed to inform their populations about the long-term consequences. And even now we're seeing, countries, Sweden, for example, has a particular issue, it seems, around long COVID. The UK has been better in acknowledging it, but there's still people that want to downplay it. And so I think if governments don't tell bring the people with them and tell them why something is important, you can't convince people to adopt the how, which is the protection strategies. So, quality of mask, N99, N95, FFP2, FFP3 is really important. As I've mentioned, air filtration and ventilation. Vaccination. Why would you vaccinate if you've heard for a year and a half that this is just the flu? Why are you going to get young people to vaccinate when they've been told, oh, this doesn't affect you? Why are parents going to vaccinate their children if they're told, well, this isn't a disease that bothers children much? By not being honest and not informing people properly, governments have failed to protect them. Because when it comes to making decisions about how to, mitigate risk, how to control the virus, we don't have the information to hand, and we're not making decisions in the right perspective. Finally, I think there's been a failure to prepare, a massive failure to prepare. And we can see this most starkly in England in particular. I won't say the UK because Scotland has been slightly better. But in England in particular, there's been a massive failure to prepare. We still don't recognize the importance of ventilation and filtration. So in New York, all public malls have to have high quality filtration that will extract the virus particles from the air. Germany's embarked on a massive investment scheme for schools, and in New York, all public schools have to have portable HEPA air filters installed in classrooms. There's nothing like that here in the UK. There's there are professional bodies that are trying to set standards, but there's nothing central from the government to say, this is what we need to do, this has to happen quickly, and we should use summer as an opportunity. It's very clear now from the SAGE modelling that's taking place here that they're planning for a fourth wave. And indeed, there have been news reports about what the fourth wave might look like and what the government's going to do for it. But there is just a general feeling of a lack of preparation, as we're now in our third wave, and there's a lack of preparation heading into a fourth wave. And it seems as though if we don't take some of the measures that are needed to control this virus, it seems as though with waning immunity, with variants, people are going to be drifting into that susceptibility pool, and we're just going to keep going through a cycle of infections. The plan is obviously for the cycle of infections for people to be impacted less severely, but it doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence to underpin that assumption.
Adam, thank you very much for that. Well, if we can move on to some questions and discussion, if people would like to, I'm not sure how we handle this, raise your virtual hand. And after the applause has died down. I really like finishing on the emphasis on ventilation is is extreme. You don't get an oration like that everywhere. Um, uh, uh, Ventilation for me is an absolutely critical issue, and one of the great disappointments for me or learning points for me is that it was so important previously in our response to pandemics. And one of the things I learnt was that my primary school in Belfast, on the Falls Road in Belfast, one of the poorest parts of Belfast, was built by an English architect, R.S. Wilshire, and he designed 30 or 40 schools in the 20s and 30s in Belfast for the Education Authority, and he built them all on sanitary principles, built on ventilation and sunlight. And they would have been fantastic schools, and are fantastic schools, those of them that are still in existence, for this time. And we seem to have lost all of that knowledge. And you're quite right drawing attention to the failure to move on from the droplet situation having been vaccinated. Someone in one of the groups I'm in described it as hygiene theatre, that they like cleaning things, obsessively cleaning things. Hygiene theatre, it gives that impression of something is being done. It makes the people who do it feel good because they are doing something, and reassures people around them, but is, of course, absolutely no effect. Have we any points or questions that anyone would like to raise with Adam?
Well, I mean, I just want to come back on that just quickly, just on a personal level. In November, when the second wave was hitting, we had a huge cluster at our youngest son's primary school, and they stopped telling us when it got to 30 cases of children and staff being infected. 2 of the staff now have long COVID and are suffering, quite debilitating conditions. And when we restarted schooling in March, I organized an initiative to get HEPA filters put into every class. And since then, obviously now we're into this third wave. They've had children come into the school with COVID and test positive, but nothing's transmitted into the school. So we've had 3 children come in, but nothing's been transmitted into the school. So we haven't seen the same dynamic of a cluster forming and transmission occurring within the school. So just from a personal level, I think, we can take steps. And this feeling that we're somehow out of control and that this is all inevitable is actually fostered by governments who are being derelict in their duties. I think, it's a massive political failure, that this sense that it's just got to happen. We've all got to get this. And actually, we're going to get it multiple times in our lives. There was a prominent scientist who did a thread on Twitter recently who said, just get used to it. You're going to catch this virus many times in your lives. We've just got to live with it.
Yeah, I'd be very interested to hear about instances of legal challenge to authorities that make these decisions. There's a system in England called judicial review, for example. It would be really interesting to learn from other countries whether people have successfully challenged the inactivity. Any questions or points anyone wants to raise? Could I just ask you, Adam, because I'm intrigued by this, how you managed to get the filters in place. Was this a parent's initiative, or was it the head teacher on your side, or the governors, or how did it come about?
So I wrote to the head teacher and I said, back in August, and I said, look, you've got to think about what's going to happen in the September term. You need to, if you can, encourage people to wear masks. And you need to look at filtration and ventilation. And he's a smart guy, but he kind of said, look, we've got to go with government guidelines. And that's been an excuse. We got 3 children in 3 different schools, and that was the excuse they all used. They said, we've got to go with government guidelines. After they had the outbreak, when he saw his staff getting impacted, when he saw the families getting impacted by the transmission that had occurred in school, it changed his attitude. And so, like many people, he kind of learnt the hard way. And so when we sort of spoke again in March, he was much more receptive, and he said, look, let's give it a try. And he said, provided they don't, cause a lot of impact in the teaching environment, I'm really up for this. And so he bought one to test. And then my wife and I contributed the cost of another 2, and then he paid for the other 6 out of special funds that they'd been given by the government. And they run silently pretty much. Occasionally they'll fire up to, really work quite hard if they sense a lot of particulates in the air, but they're not non-intrusive on any learning whatsoever. So he was really happy with them.
Very good. CO2 metering, I think, as well has been an interesting thing. And I know that the government in the Republic of Ireland has agreed that all schools will be provided with CO2 meters. I don't know how far that has been implemented yet. But I read recently of initiatives in Spain and Belgium whereby there will be O2 filtering in a lot of public buildings with display of results. Yes, Jackie, would you like to unmute yourself and make your comment? We can't hear you yet. Sorry, Jackie, I'm not hearing you for some reason. There was a question from another participant, Helen, who was asking about getting the message over. And
yeah, now it's working.
Oh, it's working. Jackie, hello. Or Helen, who was that? There was a question about. Let me ask you a question then. As someone who writes and has been a well-regarded writer, how do you look at it from the position of someone who writes novels or writes professionally, in terms of the plot lines and so on? Is this one of those occasions where it's so exceptionally, incomprehensibly impossible that?
Yeah, I don't think you could. I mean, I couldn't have written this. I don't think anyone could have, scripted this. I think some of the things have been so predictable, and you're almost like we are now in England. We're sort of steering towards disaster, and no one seems able to stop it. And that just doesn't happen in fiction. You just don't. That wouldn't make for a satisfying story. And we've all, I'm sure, experienced just strange things that have occurred in the last 18 months. So, basically in England now, they've said nightclubs can open as of the 19th without legal restrictions. But they would advise nightclubs to institute lateral flow testing and to ask for vaccination certificates if they, want to try and contribute to reducing transmission. And the head of the nightclub association, the trade body, said, well, we're not going to do that. If it's legally permissible to open nightclubs without controls, that's what we're going to do. And, the guy's name was Michael Kill. And it was just one of those things where you couldn't script that. But it's another example of political failure because they're not willing, they don't have the courage to face down their backbenchers and set some rules. They've just set guidance, and people are going to ignore the guidance because traditionally, having advised businesses, I know that traditionally you push the limits of regulation. You don't push the limits of guidance.
Yeah. Great. Jackie, would you like to try again?
Can you hear me this time?
Yeah, we can.
Yes.
There we go. So you mentioned New York City, but the most recent word from there is that they've not actually bought HEPA filters. What they've bought is some sort of air filtration device that's low efficiency and doesn't actually contain a HEPA filter. And this is one of the things that worries me, is that there's so many companies selling some sort of tech with ionizers and plasmas and all of these things in them, and they're not actually useful, and in some cases can make air pollution worse in those areas. And so without having proper guidance on this, on what we should be buying, we run the risk that people end up spending money on the wrong things.
Absolutely. Again, I'll just talk to a personal example. My sister is trying to organize filters for her children's schools, and she sent me. She said, "Oh, one of the other parents can get a discount at this company," and it was basically an ionizing air cleaner. But all over the website, they'd said it filters 100% of SARS-CoV-2 virus out of the air. And I looked for the specs and everything, and it was just an ionizer with very low filtration rating. And you're absolutely right. It would have been a danger. So you're completely right to say, without this is a pandemic is a community threat. And without community level leadership, without common guidelines and a common approach, we're going to fail. And so this sort of cult of the individual that you see in Western countries, where it's libertarianism and you should just get on with your own life and assess your own risk. How do you do that with an airborne, highly contagious pathogen? It's just impossible. You need a central role, a central function for government. And if you look at the countries that have succeeded, they've shown strong leadership, they've brought their communities with them, and they've had common rules and common guidelines.
Good. Thank you very much, Adam, and thank you for your contribution.